2 days. That's all I was gone. 48 hours at a livestock auction 3 counties away. And somehow, that was enough time for a group of people I'd barely spoken to in years to decide they knew what to do with land my family had owned since before most of them ever moved into town. The moment I turned off Mill Creek Road and headed toward my west pasture, I knew something wasn't right. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. The maple trees were still lining the fence row. The old red barn was exactly where it had always been. Even the rusty windmill on the ridge was turning in the same lazy circles it had for decades. But then I saw it, a bright white vinyl fence stretching across the middle of my pasture. Not near it, not beside it, across it. I slowed my truck until it was practically crawling. For a second, I honestly wondered if I'd somehow taken the wrong road. I looked at the mailbox. I looked at the barn. I looked at the pond. Nope, this was definitely my ranch. My name is Ethan Walker. I own 43 acres outside of town called Pine Hollow, a quiet little place where people wave from their porches and everybody somehow knows your business before you do. My father bought the property in 1987. After he passed away, it became mine. Nothing fancy. A few cattle, a couple barns, more repairs than money some years, and enough open land to make me feel like I could breathe. The west pasture was probably the best section of the property. Every spring, I'd rotate cattle through it because the grass grew thick and healthy there. There was also an old dirt service road cutting through one corner, something I'd built years ago, so hay trucks could move between fields without tearing up the pasture. Useful, simple, nothing anybody would pay attention to, or so I thought. I parked the truck and walked toward the new fence. Fresh concrete around every post. Fresh paint. Fresh signs. Private community boundary. Residents only. No trespassing. I remember standing there reading those signs 3 different times because my brain refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. Then I laughed. Just one short laugh. The kind that comes out when you're too confused to be angry yet. That's when I noticed an envelope sticking out of my mailbox. No stamp. No return address. Just my name written across the front. Inside was a letter from the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Now, Willow Creek was one of those newer subdivisions built behind my property about 4 years earlier. Perfect sidewalks, perfect lawns, perfect matching mailboxes. Every house looked like it came out of the same catalog. I never had a problem with them. Truthfully, I rarely thought about them at all, but apparently they had been thinking about me. According to the letter, the HOA board had approved an expansion of their community boundary into what they described as an unused transitional green space, in order to improve traffic flow, resident safety, and neighborhood appearance. Unused transitional green space. That's what they call my pasture. Land that fed my cattle every single year. Land listed on my deed. Land my father spent decades paying taxes on. I read that sentence at least 5 times. Every time it sounded dumber. But underneath the irritation was something else. Curiosity. Because people don't spend thousands of dollars building fences unless they've convinced themselves they're right. So I drove back to the house, grabbed my survey records, and headed out again. And that's when things got weird. Really weird. The further I followed the fence line, the more obvious it became that this wasn't some innocent mistake. They weren't off by a few feet. They weren't off by 10 feet. They were over 100 feet inside my property. 100 feet. You don't accidentally end up 100 feet onto somebody else's land. That's a decision. That's somebody looking at ownership records and deciding they don't matter. I kept driving until I reached the far end of the pasture where my old service road curved around a stand of cedar trees. And then I found the second surprise. Fresh gravel. Lots of it. Spread across what used to be grazing land. And parked on top of that gravel were rows and rows of vehicles. SUVs. Pickup trucks, sedans, at least 30 of them. For a moment, I just stared. People were walking back toward the subdivision, carrying groceries and coffee cups, completely unaware that they were standing on private property. Then the final piece clicked into place. That old dirt service road I'd built years ago, it was now the only practical entrance to the parking lot. Every single vehicle sitting there depended on access through my land. I leaned against my truck and watched the scene unfold. Most people probably would have called a lawyer right then. Maybe marched straight into an HOA meeting. Maybe started screaming. But ranching teaches you something after enough years. Sometimes the fastest way to reveal the truth isn't to chase people. It's to let them run into reality all by themselves. And standing there in that pasture, watching 30 vehicles parked where my cattle should have been grazing, an idea slowly started forming in my head. A very simple idea. One involving a stack of steel livestock panels sitting in my equipment shed. One that didn't require an argument. One that didn't require permission. And by the time the sun started dropping behind the hills, I was already heading toward the barn with a plan that was about to make the entire subdivision very uncomfortable. By the time I pulled into the equipment shed, the plan had become crystal clear in my mind. Not because I was angry anymore. Truthfully, the anger had mostly burned off during the drive back. What replaced it was something far more useful. Patience. People always imagine revenge as some dramatic emotional outburst. But the most effective responses usually happen when emotions finally get out of the way. Inside the shed sat nearly 24 steel livestock panels I collected over the years. Some were newer than others. A few carried dents from stubborn cattle and rough winters. Every one of them was heavy, solid, and built to stay exactly where you put it. Beside them sat my skid steer. I remember looking at both and saying out loud, "Well, boys, looks like we got ourselves a project." The first panel went up around 3 that afternoon. Then another. Then another. I wasn't rushing. There was no dramatic music playing in my head. No grand speech. Just steady work. By 4 o'clock, I'd blocked the eastern access point. By 5, I'd secured the southern opening. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, I connected each panel with heavy chains and reinforced every corner. The entire time, residents came and went completely unaware. A woman jogged past with headphones on. A teenager walked by carrying a soccer bag. One man drove into the lot, parked his SUV, and headed home without even glancing in my direction. Nobody questioned what I was doing. Nobody asked why. The assumption that everything belonged to them had become so normal they never considered otherwise. Around sunset, I completed the final section. The enclosure was finished. Every vehicle remained exactly where it had been parked. Nothing was damaged. Nothing was touched. The only thing that changed was access. I stood there for a moment, looking over the gravel lot. 30-something vehicles sitting quietly behind steel panels. Then I climbed into my truck and drove home. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because I enjoyed conflict. Actually, I hate conflict. But there was something strangely peaceful about knowing I hadn't crossed a single legal line. Every inch of ground involved belonged to me. Every fence panel sat on my property. Every lock hung from my chain. The rest would sort itself out. At 6:08 the next morning, my phone exploded. The first call woke me up. I ignored it. Then another came in. Then another. By the time I made coffee, I had 14 missed calls and 8 voicemails. The first voicemail was confused. The second was irritated. The third sounded like someone was having a minor medical emergency. The fourth included language I won't repeat on YouTube. I finally answered one around 7. A woman immediately launched into panic mode. "Mr. Walker, there are residents trapped inside the overflow parking area." I took a sip of coffee. "Really?" "Yes, really. That's unfortunate." There was a pause. Then she snapped. "You know exactly what we're talking about." "Actually," I said calmly, "I'm still trying to understand how 30 vehicles ended up parked on my ranch." Click. She hung up. The calls kept coming. HOA board members, residents, property managers. One guy introduced himself as a community consultant. Another claimed I was illegally detaining private property. A third threatened lawsuits before he'd even said hello. I responded to every one of them the same way. I emailed copies of my survey, copies of my deed, county property records, photographs, measurements, dates, no insights, no commentary, just facts. Facts are funny things. People can argue with emotions all day long. Facts tend to be less flexible. Around 10 that morning, a black luxury SUV came tearing down my driveway, throwing enough dust behind it to start a small weather system. Out stepped Lauren Pierce, president of the Willow Creek Estates HOA. I recognized her immediately. We'd met once during a county planning meeting. Lauren had a talent for smiling while explaining why everyone else needed to make adjustments. That smile was nowhere to be found today. She stormed across the yard like she intended to personally declare war. "This is ridiculous," she shouted before she even reached the porch. I continued drinking coffee. "Morning. People cannot access their vehicles. Looks that way. You blocked the parking lot." "No," I said. "I enclosed my property." Her face tightened. "That area was approved community space." I almost laughed. "Approved by who?" "The board. The board owns my ranch now." Her jaw flexed. "You know exactly what I mean." "No, yeah. Actually, I don't." For a second, neither of us spoke. Then she pointed toward the pasture. "We invested money into improving that area. On land you don't own. It wasn't being used." That statement hit a nerve. Not because it was insulting, because it revealed exactly how they justified everything. To them, ownership depended on visibility. If they couldn't see cattle standing there every day, then apparently nobody needed it. I set my coffee down. "My father bought that land 39 years ago." Lauren crossed her arms. "That's irrelevant." "No," I said quietly. "That's the only thing that's relevant." For a brief moment, I thought she might actually understand. Instead, she doubled down. "You are creating serious liability for yourself." I pointed toward the parking lot. "You built a commercial-sized parking area on private property." Her expression hardened. "This isn't over." Then she turned around and left. As her SUV disappeared down the driveway, I couldn't help thinking she was right. It wasn't over. Not even close. By that afternoon, the situation had become the biggest source of entertainment Pine Hollow had seen in years. Residents gathered near the fence taking photographs. Some were angry. Some were embarrassed. A surprising number looked amused. Around lunchtime, an older gentleman walked across the pasture and introduced himself. His name was Harold Benson, retired school principal, lived inside Willow Creek. After making sure nobody else was listening, he leaned closer. "For what it's worth," he said, "I voted against that fence." I nodded. "Appreciate that." He glanced toward the trapped vehicles. Then a grin spread across his face. "Still wish I brought popcorn." That nearly made me choke laughing. News spread through town fast. Small towns operate like living organisms. Information travels faster than electricity. By dinner, people were discussing the situation at diners, gas stations, feed stores, church parking lots, and every Facebook group within 50 miles. Then somebody posted drone footage. That changed everything. The aerial video showed the entire situation perfectly. The actual property line, the HOA fence, the gravel lot, the parked vehicles, and just how far onto my land the subdivision had expanded. Thousands of people watched it within hours. Comments flooded in. Some call me stubborn. Others call me a hero. One comment simply read, "He didn't trap their cars. They parked them in his pasture." Honestly, that might have been the most accurate summary of the entire situation. The next morning, things got worse for Willow Creek. The novelty had worn off. Now, people had real problems. Several residents couldn't get to work. A landscaping company couldn't access equipment. Delivery trucks were being rerouted. Tension inside the subdivision was rising by the hour. Then my favorite moment happened. Around noon, a tow truck arrived. Apparently somebody on the HOA board hired it to remove my barriers. The driver climbed out, examined the survey documents I'd attached to the fence, studied the county map for about 30 seconds, then slowly shook his head. "No." That was all he said. "Nope." Then he climbed back into his truck and drove away. I stood there watching him disappear down the road and laughed harder than I had all week. Because for the first time, cracks were beginning to show. The confidence, the certainty, the assumption that authority automatically creates ownership. All of it was starting to crumble, and none of us knew it yet. But the people inside Willow Creek were about to discover something far more dangerous than an angry rancher. They were about to discover what happens when public opinion, legal documents, and cold reality all end up standing on the same side of an argument. By the third morning, the mood around Willow Creek had completely changed. The first day had felt like a spectacle. The second day felt like an inconvenience. By the third day, people were looking for someone to blame. And for the first time, that blame wasn't pointing at me. Around 9 that morning, a county deputy named Mark Holloway pulled onto the property. Professional guy, calm, patient, the kind of person who'd probably seen every version of human stupidity a rural county could produce. He spent nearly 2 hours walking the property with me. We reviewed surveys, county maps, property records, photographs, everything. Not long after that, Lauren arrived with 2 HOA board members and an attorney who looked increasingly uncomfortable with every passing minute. Nobody was yelling anymore. That alone told me plenty. The deputy eventually gathered everyone near the disputed fence line and opened his folder. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then he closed it. The property records appear clear. Silence. The survey records appear clear. More silence. He looked toward the HOA representatives. This is a civil matter. Lauren immediately stepped forward. But he's restricting access. The deputy shrugged. Access to vehicles currently located on his property. The attorney closed his eyes. Just for a second. But it was enough. That tiny reaction told me everything. Because lawyers don't rub their temples when they're winning. That was the moment reality finally arrived. No county official was going to rewrite ownership records. No emergency exception was coming. No magical loophole existed. The HOA had built a fence and parking lot on land they didn't own. And now everyone knew it. That afternoon, I received a phone call from the HOA attorney. The tone was dramatically different from earlier conversations. No threats, no accusations, just one simple request. We'd like to schedule a meeting. I remember smiling after I hung up. 3 days earlier, they had been issuing demands. Now, they were requesting appointments. Amazing what paperwork can do. The meeting took place the following morning inside a conference room above an insurance office downtown. Nothing fancy. Cheap coffee. Fluorescent lights. The kind of room where people suddenly become much more honest than they intended. Lauren sat across from me. The 2 board members sat beside her. Their attorney occupied the far end of the table. A county mediator sat quietly in the corner taking notes. Nobody looked particularly happy, especially not Lauren. The attorney started things off. Mr. Walker, we'd like to discuss resolution options. Resolution. Interesting word. It's amazing how quickly people stop talking about principles once consequences start appearing. For nearly 2 hours, we worked through every issue. The fence, the gravel lot, the unauthorized use of my service road, damage to grazing land, pasture restoration, loss of seasonal cattle rotation. Everything had documentation. Everything had costs. Everything had records. I didn't exaggerate a single thing. I didn't need to. Reality was already expensive enough. Eventually, the conversation shifted. The board stopped arguing. Then they stopped negotiating. Finally, they started agreeing. One item after another. Remove the fence. Remove the gravel. Restore the pasture. Pay for damages. Cover restoration costs. Sign a permanent access agreement acknowledging property boundaries. By the end of the meeting, the outcome was obvious. The fight was over. All that remained was paperwork. As everyone gathered their documents, something unexpected happened. Lauren spoke. Not loudly. Not defensively. Just quietly. We honestly believed that area wasn't being used. The room fell silent. I looked at her for a moment. And honestly, for the first time all week, she sounded sincere. Not correct, but sincere. I leaned back in my chair. That's the thing about private property, I said. Whether I'm standing on it today isn't what determines who owns it. She lowered her eyes, then nodded. No argument, no speech, no excuses, just a nod. And somehow that meant more than every heated conversation we'd had before. The next morning, I unlocked the steel panels. Residents finally retrieved their vehicles. Most avoided eye contact. A few offered polite waves. One woman actually stopped and apologized. Not for herself, for the whole situation. That surprised me. Then Harold rolled past in his pickup truck. Window down. Huge grin on his face. He pointed toward the now empty parking area. Best entertainment this town's had in 20 years. I laughed. Honestly, by then, so did everyone else. The following weeks were almost anticlimactic. Contractors removed the white vinyl fence section by section. Truckloads of gravel disappeared. Damaged ground was leveled. Fresh seed was spread across the pasture. By late summer, green grass had returned. The scars faded. The cattle didn't seem to care. They wandered right back into the field as if none of the drama had ever happened. Maybe that's one of the reasons I enjoy ranching. Animals don't care about politics. They don't care about titles. They don't care who won an argument. They simply respond to reality. And reality doesn't negotiate. About 6 months later, I happened to drive past Willow Creek on my way into town. Everything looked exactly the same. The manicured lawns, the matching mailboxes, the tidy sidewalks. But one detail had changed. The white fence still existed. Only now it sat exactly where it should have from the beginning, right on the legal boundary, not 1 inch farther. I slowed down for a moment and looked at it. Then I noticed something else. The subdivision had built an alternate access road around the far side of the property. Longer, more expensive, less convenient. Residents now had to drive several extra minutes every day, all because somebody had decided asking permission was harder than taking a shortcut. I sat there for a moment thinking about that, because the truth is, had they approached me from the beginning, things might have gone differently. Maybe I would have said yes. Maybe I would have said no. But we'd never know. They never asked. They assumed. And assumptions have a funny habit of becoming expensive once lawyers and surveyors get involved. These days, people still bring up the story from time to time. Usually somebody at a diner will point across the room and say, "Hey, that's the guy who fenced in the HOA cars." Technically, that isn't what happened, but I've learned it's usually easier to smile than explain. The truth is, I never wanted a fight. I never wanted attention. I just wanted my pasture back. What stayed with me wasn't the fence. It wasn't the parking lot. It wasn't even the argument. It was the mindset behind it all. The idea that convenience somehow outweighs ownership. That if someone isn't actively using something every minute of every day, then maybe their rights become negotiable. That's a dangerous way to think. Because once people start deciding which rights matter and which don't, boundaries stop meaning much of anything. So now I'm curious what you think. Was I right to close access to land that legally belonged to me? Should I have skipped the steel panels and gone straight to court? Or do you think there was a better solution somewhere in the middle? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because stories like this always split people right down the center. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, a property dispute, an entitled neighbor, or someone who thought rules only applied to other people, I'd love to hear your story too. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications because the next story might make this one seem simple.